The gunshot that rang out behind the mercantile wasn't meant for Florence Earnsworth, but it was the sound that would unravel every certainty in her carefully planned life. She stood frozen on the dusty main street of Fort Stockton, Texas, her hand clutching the list of wedding supplies her mother had given her that morning, while men shouted and horses whinnied in alarm. It was July 1878, and the heat pressed down like a wool blanket, making her corset feel even tighter than usual as her breath came quick and shallow. "Miss Earnsworth, you need to get inside." The voice came from a man she'd seen around town but never properly met. He had his hand on her elbow, firm but not rough, guiding her toward the general store's covered porch. His eyes were the color of creek water in summer, clear and brown with flecks of gold, and his face was shadowed by the brim of a dusty hat. "What happened?" Florence managed to ask, her voice steadier than she felt. At 22, she prided herself on maintaining composure, a trait her mother had drilled into her since childhood. Ladies did not panic. Ladies did not make scenes. "Just some trouble," the cowboy said, his jaw tight. "Nothing for you to worry about." But Florence could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his other hand rested near the pistol at his hip. She'd lived in Fort Stockton for 3 years since her father had moved the family from Virginia to start a freight business, and she'd learned to read the difference between casual Saturday afternoon disagreements and something darker. The cowboy waited until she was safely under the porch overhang before he touched the brim of his hat and started to walk away. "Wait," Florence called out, surprising herself. "I don't even know your name." He turned back, and for a moment something flickered across his face, an expression she couldn't quite read. "Xavier Landry, madam. I work the Monroe Ranch north of town." "Thank you, Mr. Landry." He nodded once and disappeared around the corner, his boots leaving prints in the dust that the wind would erase before nightfall. Florence watched him go, then realized her heart was racing, and it wasn't entirely from the excitement of the gunshot. She shook her head, dismissing the thought immediately. In 3 weeks, she would marry Preston Whitmore, the most eligible man in Fort Stockton, and she had no business noticing other men, especially drifting cowboys who probably moved from ranch to ranch without ever putting down roots. Preston was everything her parents had hoped for in a son-in-law. His father owned the bank, the largest ranch in the county, and had investments in the railroad that was slowly making its way through West Texas. Preston himself was handsome in a refined way, with perfectly combed blonde hair and suits that looked like they came straight from New York. He spoke beautifully, had impeccable manners, and treated Florence like she was made of fine china. She pushed through the door of the general store, the bell jangling overhead, and was immediately enveloped by the familiar smells of coffee, leather, and the lavender soap Mrs. Henderson kept in a basket by the register. The shopkeeper looked up from her ledger, her round face creased with concern. "Florence, dear, are you all right? That commotion outside sounded dreadful." "I'm fine, Mrs. Henderson. Do you know what happened?" The older woman leaned forward, lowering her voice even though they were the only 2 people in the store. "I heard it was Jim Patterson's boy, drunk again and waving his pistol around. Someone said Xavier Landry talked him down before the sheriff got there. That boy works for your fiancé's father, doesn't he? The Landry fellow, I mean." Florence felt a strange flutter in her chest at the mention of Xavier's name. "I wouldn't know. Preston doesn't discuss ranch business with me." "Of course not, dear. That's not proper." "Mrs. Henderson smiled and gestured toward the shelves. "Now, what can I help you find today? Not long until the wedding now. Your mother must be beside herself with excitement." For the next hour, Florence focused on selecting ribbons and lace, discussing flower arrangements, and making decisions about things that suddenly felt trivial. Her mind kept drifting to the cowboy with the creek water eyes, the firmness of his hand on her elbow, the way he'd positioned himself between her and whatever danger lurked around that corner. Preston had never touched her with such certainty, such natural protectiveness. Preston's touches were always careful, measured, appropriate. When she finally left the store, her arms full of packages, the sun was starting its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Fort Stockton was a small town, really just a military post that had grown into a settlement, and the main street was only a few blocks long. Most of the buildings were made of adobe or rough-cut lumber, practical structures built to withstand the harsh climate and occasional raids that had been more common before the fort was fully established. Florence was halfway to her family's house, a two-story frame building her father had proudly constructed when they'd arrived, when she saw Preston's carriage pulled up outside the saloon. That wasn't unusual. Preston often conducted business there, meeting with ranchers and investors over whiskey. What made Florence slow her steps was the woman climbing down from the carriage, her dress far too fine for a weekday afternoon, her laugh carrying across the street like bells. The woman was beautiful in a bold way that Florence had been taught to disdain. Dark hair piled high, lips painted red, a dress that showed more ankle than was proper. Preston appeared in the saloon doorway and offered his arm, and the woman took it, leaning close to whisper something that made Preston throw his head back and laugh. Florence had never seen him laugh like that, so unreserved and genuine. She stood there in the street, packages growing heavy in her arms, watching her fiancé escort this woman into the saloon like she was a queen. The logical part of Florence's mind supplied reasonable explanations. Perhaps she was the wife of an investor. Perhaps this was legitimate business. But the tightness in her chest suggested her instincts knew better than her logic. That's the third time this week. Florence spun around to find Xavier Landry standing a few feet behind her, his hat now pushed back on his head, his expression carefully neutral. "I beg your pardon?" Florence's voice came out sharper than she intended, defensive. "Forgive me, Miss Earnsworth. I shouldn't have spoken." He moved to walk past her, but Florence stepped into his path, her heart hammering. "What do you mean the third time this week?" Xavier's jaw worked, and he looked away, toward the mountains in the distance, anywhere but at her face. "It's not my place to say anything. I apologize for speaking out of turn." "Mr. Landry?" Florence drew herself up to her full height, which was still several inches shorter than him. "If you know something about Preston, about my fiancé, I have a right to know." "Do you?" He finally looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that might have been pity, or might have been anger. "In my experience, people don't want to hear truths that'll hurt them. They want to keep living in their comfortable lies. I am not most people." A smile ghosted across his face, there and gone so quick she almost missed it. "No, madam, I don't suppose you are." He glanced around the street, then gestured toward the alley beside the general store. "Not here." Florence followed him, knowing it was improper, knowing her mother would be horrified if she found out her daughter had gone into an alley with a cowboy she barely knew, but she'd seen something in Xavier's face that told her whatever he had to say, she needed to hear it. The alley provided some shade and privacy. Xavier leaned against the wall, and for a moment he just studied her, like he was trying to decide how much truth she could handle. "That woman's name is Delilah Royce. She runs the girls at the saloon, but she's more than that. She and Preston have been conducting business together for months now." "What kind of business?" Florence kept her voice level, even though her hands were shaking. "The kind that involves your father's freight company." Xavier pulled a piece of paper from his pocket, unfolded it carefully, and handed it to her. "I found this in the ranch office last week. I probably shouldn't have taken it, but something didn't sit right with me." Florence looked down at the paper. It was a ledger page, filled with numbers and dates, notations about shipments and payments. Her father's company name was listed multiple times, along with the Whitmore Ranch. But there were other names too, ones she didn't recognize, and the amounts of money made her breath catch. "I don't understand what I'm looking at." "Those are records of goods being shipped through your father's company that don't appear in the official books. Preston has been using the freight business to transport items he doesn't want the law knowing about. Whiskey into dry counties, guns, other things." Xavier's voice was quiet but firm. "And he's been keeping the profits while making it look like your father's company is doing all the business. If anyone investigates, your father will be the one who hangs, not Preston." Florence's packages slipped from her arms, ribbons and lace spilling into the dirt. Her mind raced, connecting pieces she'd been too trusting to see before. The way Preston had been so eager to court her, how quickly he'd pushed for marriage, the questions he'd asked about her father's routes and schedules, questions she'd answered innocently, proud that her fiancé took interest in her family's business. "Why are you telling me this?" she whispered. "If Preston finds out, he'll have you killed." "Probably." Xavier bent to help gather her packages, his hands brushing hers as he handed them back. The touch sent warmth up her arm that she had no business feeling. "But I couldn't stand by and watch him ruin your family. Your father's a good man. He doesn't deserve to be used like this." "And me? What about me?" Xavier stood, and for a moment they were so close Florence could see the darker ring around his irises, could smell the scent of leather and sage that clung to him. You deserve the truth. What you do with it is your choice. I could show this to my father right now. We could go to the sheriff. You could, Xavier agreed. But the sheriff's in Preston's father's pocket. The judge, too. The Whitmores own this town, Miss Earnsworth. That's why I haven't gone to the law myself. Who's going to believe a drifting cowboy over the banker's son? Florence felt the walls of her carefully planned future crumbling around her. In 3 weeks, she was supposed to marry Preston. Her mother had already had the dress altered twice. The invitations had been sent. The church was reserved. Everyone in Fort Stockton would be there, and it was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. I need proof, she said finally. Real proof, something that even the Whitmores' money can't deny. That's dangerous talk, Miss Earnsworth. Florence, if we're going to be co-conspirators, you might as well call me Florence. She met his eyes, saw the surprise there, followed by something that might have been admiration. Can you get me more evidence? Documents, witnesses, something concrete? Xavier was quiet for a long moment, weighing something in his mind. There's a shipment coming in tomorrow night. Preston doesn't know I know about it, but I overheard him and his father talking. They're bringing in rifles to sell to the Comancheros, guns that are supposed to be going to the army. If we can catch them in the act, document it somehow. That might be enough proof to bring to the federal marshal in El Paso. Then that's what we'll do. Florence. The way he said her name made it sound like something precious. This isn't some adventure story. Preston is dangerous. He's not the gentleman he pretends to be. I've seen what he does to people who cross him. Then we'd better make sure he doesn't know we're crossing him. Florence gathered her packages, her mind already racing ahead to what they would need, how they could expose Preston without getting themselves killed in the process. Where should I meet you tomorrow? You're not meeting me anywhere. I'll handle this myself and bring you the evidence. Florence stepped closer, her chin lifted in defiance. Mr. Landry, that's my father's business being used for criminal activity. That's my name about to be tied to the Whitmore family through marriage. This affects me just as much as anyone, and I will not sit at home wringing my hands while you risk your life alone. Now, where and when? A slow smile spread across Xavier's face, transforming it from handsome to devastating. Yes, madam, I can see arguing with you is a waste of breath. He thought for a moment. There's an old line shack on the northern edge of the Whitmore property, about 5 miles out of town. The shipment's coming in around midnight tomorrow. If you can get there by 11, we'll have time to position ourselves to see everything without being seen. I'll be there. Florence started to walk away, then turned back. Xavier, thank you for telling me the truth. Don't thank me yet. Truth has a way of hurting worse than lies. Florence made her way home, her mind spinning with what she'd learned. When she walked through the door, her mother was in the parlor with 3 other women, discussing the wedding breakfast menu. They all looked up expectantly, and Florence had to force a smile, had to pretend her entire world hadn't just shifted on its axis. Florence, darling, did you get the ribbon I wanted? Her mother called out. Yes, mother. Everything on the list. Florence set her packages on the hall table. I'm feeling rather tired from the heat. I think I'll lie down before dinner. Of course, dear. You need your rest. A bride must look her best. Florence escaped to her room, closing the door and leaning against it. Her reflection stared back at her from the mirror above her dresser. A young woman with dark blonde hair pinned up properly, gray eyes that usually looked serene, a face that her mother said was pretty enough to catch a good husband. She looked the same as she had that morning, but she felt completely different. That night at dinner, Preston came calling, as he did 3 times a week. He sat at their dining table, charming her mother with compliments and discussing business prospects with her father. Florence watched him with new eyes, seeing the calculation behind his smile, the way his hand gestures were too perfect, too practiced. When he took her hand to say goodnight, his touch felt cold, nothing like the warmth that had shot through her when Xavier's fingers had brushed hers. Only 3 more weeks, my dear, Preston said, lifting her hand to his lips. And then you'll be Mrs. Preston Whitmore. I hope you're as eager for that day as I am. Of course, Florence murmured, because what else could she say with her parents watching fondly? But she felt sick, thinking about what marriage to this man would mean, the lies she would be expected to perpetuate, the crimes she would be unwittingly complicit in. After Preston left, Florence's father called her into his study. He was a big man, made bigger by the responsibilities he carried, his hair graying at the temples, his hands rough from years of hard work. He'd built his freight company from nothing, and Florence knew how much pride he took in his reputation for honest dealing. "Florence, sit down." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "I want to talk to you about something." Florence's heart raced. Did he know? Had someone seen her talking to Xavier? "I know I haven't said much about your upcoming marriage," her father continued, "but I want you to know how proud I am. The Whitmores are a fine family, and Preston will give you the kind of life your mother and I always wanted for you." He paused, his expression troubled. "But I also want you to know that if you're having any doubts, any reservations at all, it's not too late to change your mind. What makes you think I have doubts? A father knows his daughter. You've seemed distant lately, distracted. If this is just wedding nerves, that's natural. But if it's something more, I need you to tell me." Florence thought about showing him the ledger page, telling him everything Xavier had revealed. But without more proof, what good would it do? Preston would deny it, his father would use his influence, and they'd find a way to twist it around, maybe even blame her father for any irregularities. No, she needed solid evidence first. "I'm fine, Papa. Just tired, like I told Mother." She stood and kissed his cheek. "Thank you for caring enough to ask." The next day dragged by with agonizing slowness. Florence helped her mother with wedding preparations, nodded at appropriate times, and tried not to think about what she was planning to do that night. When evening came, she pleaded a headache and went to her room early. She waited until the house was quiet, until she was certain her parents were asleep, before she changed out of her nightgown and into the most practical dress she owned, a simple brown calico that wouldn't show dirt. Getting out of the house without being heard was easier than she'd expected. She'd done it before, sneaking out to meet friends when she was younger, and the old oak tree beside her window still had sturdy branches. The hardest part was getting to the stable without alerting the dogs. Her father kept 2 horses there, and she saddled the gentler one, a mare named Daisy, who wouldn't spook easily. The ride to the Whitmore property took longer than she'd hoped. The moon was bright enough to see by, but she had to go slowly, careful of gopher holes and rough terrain. Fort Stockton sat in an area of West Texas that was more desert than anything, with scrubby plants and rocky soil, mountains rising in the distance like sleeping giants. The night air was cooler than the day but still warm, carrying the scent of sage and dust. She found the line shack by following Xavier's directions, a small structure that looked abandoned in the moonlight. Xavier's horse was already there, tied in the shadow of the building. When Florence dismounted, he emerged from the darkness like a ghost, making her gasp. "Sorry," he said quietly. "Didn't mean to startle you. I'm glad you made it safely." "Did you think I wouldn't come?" "I hoped you'd have better sense than to come, but I'm learning not to underestimate you." He took Daisy's reins and secured her next to his own mount. "The shipment's due in about an hour. There's a ravine about a quarter mile from here where they're planning to make the exchange. I scouted it this afternoon. We can hide in the rocks above and see everything without being spotted." They walked in silence, Xavier leading the way with the confidence of someone who knew the land. Florence tried not to think about how improper this was, how ruined she would be if anyone found out she'd been alone with a man at night. But those concerns seemed trivial compared to stopping Preston from destroying her father. The ravine was really just a dry creek bed, carved out by water that only flowed during the rare rains. Boulders were scattered along the edges, providing plenty of cover. Xavier found them a spot with a clear view of the ravine floor, sheltered by an overhanging rock. They settled in to wait. "Can I ask you something?" Florence whispered after a few minutes. "Why did you come to Fort Stockton? You said you're a drifting cowboy, but you don't seem like you're just passing through." Xavier was quiet for so long, she thought he wouldn't answer. "I grew up in Louisiana," he finally said. "My father had a small farm. When I was 18, a man came through claiming my father owed him money from a business deal. The debt was real, but the amount he claimed was 10 times what was actually owed. When my father couldn't pay, this man took everything. The farm, the livestock, even my mother's jewelry. My father died of a heart attack 6 months later. My mother followed him within the year. I'm so sorry. The man who did it was respected, powerful, just like the Whitmores. No one would stand up to him, and I was too young, too powerless to fight him. I've been drifting ever since, working ranches, trying to figure out what I'm supposed to do with my life." He glanced at her, his face half in shadow. When I started working for the Whitmores and realized what Preston was doing, it felt like history repeating itself. I couldn't walk away this time. I couldn't let him ruin another good family the way that man ruined mine. Florence reached out without thinking, her hand finding his in the darkness. We'll stop him. Together. Xavier's fingers closed around hers, warm and strong. Florence, I need you to understand something. After tonight, if we succeed, everything is going to change. The Whitmores won't let this go unpunished. You'll be safe because you're a woman, and because exposing Preston will mean breaking your engagement, which protects you. But me, I'll have to leave Fort Stockton, probably Texas entirely. The thought of Xavier leaving sent an unexpected pain through Florence's chest. She'd only known him for 2 days, had spoken to him for perhaps an hour total, but the idea of never seeing him again felt wrong in a way she couldn't explain. Then I'll leave too, she said impulsively. Florence, I mean it. There's nothing for me here after this. My reputation will be ruined by the broken engagement. Everyone will blame me, even when they learn the truth. They'll say I should have stood by Preston anyway, that a lady doesn't cause such scandal. The words poured out, and Florence realized they were true, even as she spoke them. I don't want that life, Xavier. I don't want to be the kind of woman who sits quietly while men make all the decisions and control everything. I want more. What do you want? Before Florence could answer, the sound of approaching horses froze them both. Xavier's hand tightened on hers, then released as he shifted position to see better. A wagon came into view, driven by 2 men Florence didn't recognize, rough-looking characters with pistols visible at their hips. Behind them rode Preston and his father, Andrew Whitmore, along with 3 other men. Stay absolutely still, Xavier breathed in her ear. Don't move no matter what you see. The wagon came to a stop in the center of the ravine. One of the rough men jumped down and pulled back the canvas covering the wagon bed, revealing crates stacked neatly. Andrew Whitmore dismounted and walked over to inspect them, prying open one of the crates with a crowbar. 50 rifles, just as promised, the wagon driver said. His accent was thick, possibly Mexican. The ammunition's in the smaller crates. And you're sure these can't be traced back to the Army shipment? Andrew's voice carried clearly in the still night air. We were very careful, Mr. Whitmore. The paperwork will show they were destroyed in a fire during transport. No one's going to ask questions. Preston rode closer, and Florence felt her stomach turn as she watched him count out a stack of bills. This should cover everything, plus your trouble. When can we expect the next shipment? 2 months, maybe 3. We need to let things cool down first. Acceptable. Andrew Whitmore closed the crate and nodded to his men. Load these onto our wagon and take them to the northern warehouse. Preston, you make sure the books are adjusted properly. I don't want any record of this that could come back to hurt us. Already taken care of, Father. I've got Earnsworth's freight company listed as the shipper. If anyone investigates, they'll find all the paperwork pointing to him. Florence's hands clenched into fists. Hearing Preston say her father's name with such casual cruelty made her want to scream, to rush down there and claw at his face. Xavier must have sensed her fury because his hand found her shoulder, holding her steady. The exchange continued for another 20 minutes, the men loading crates and discussing future dealings. Florence forced herself to memorize every detail, every face, everything that was said. This had to be enough. This had to be the evidence they needed. Finally, the group began to disperse. The rough men took the now empty wagon and headed south, while the Whitmores and their men went north with their illegal cargo. Xavier and Florence waited until the sound of hooves had faded completely before they moved. We need to get to El Paso, Xavier said as they scrambled down from their hiding place. The federal marshal's office is there. They'll have jurisdiction over this, and the Whitmores can't buy them off as easily. El Paso is 2 days' ride from here. I know. Can you get away for that long without your parents raising an alarm? Florence thought quickly. I can tell them I'm going to visit my aunt in San Angelo. Mother's been suggesting I go see her before the wedding anyway. If I leave in the morning, they won't expect me back for several days. They reached the horses, and Xavier helped Florence mount, his hands on her waist, sending that same warm shiver through her. In the moonlight, his face looked different, younger somehow, and Florence realized he couldn't be much older than her, maybe 25 at most. Xavier, she said, as he prepared to mount his own horse. What you said earlier about leaving Texas, did you mean it? I don't see much choice. What if you didn't leave alone? He looked up at her, and even in the dim light she could see the question in his eyes. Florence, you don't know what you're saying. The heat of the moment, the excitement of what we just saw, it's making you think things you don't mean. Don't tell me what I mean. Florence leaned down from her saddle, bringing her face closer to his. I've spent my entire life being told what to think, what to feel, what to want. For once, I know exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying that somewhere in the last 2 days, you've become the most real thing in my life. I'm saying that when I think about my future, I don't want it to look like what my parents planned. I want adventure. I want honesty. I want someone who sees me as more than just a pretty ornament. She paused, her heart racing. I want you. Xavier's hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing across her skin with a gentleness that made her breath catch. You barely know me. I know enough. I know you risked everything to tell me the truth. I know you're brave and honorable. I know that when you touch me, I feel more alive than I ever did with Preston. She covered his hand with hers. Tell me you don't feel this too. Florence. Her name was half prayer, half surrender. I felt it the moment I saw you standing in that street, looking so lost and brave at the same time. I've been trying not to feel it because you were engaged to another man, because I had no right, because I'm nobody, and you deserve everything. You're not nobody, you're Xavier Landry, and you're the man who saved my family. Florence leaned closer, and then their lips were meeting in a kiss that sent lightning through her veins. It was nothing like the chaste pecks Preston had given her. This was heat and hunger, promise and passion, everything she'd read about in books, but never thought she'd actually feel. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. We should get you home before someone notices you're gone. We can figure out the rest tomorrow. The ride back to town was faster than the ride out, adrenaline and new emotions making the time fly. When they reached the edge of Florence's property, Xavier caught her hand. Be careful tomorrow. Pack light, only what you absolutely need. We'll be traveling hard to El Paso, and we can't afford to be slowed down by luggage. When should I meet you? The stage leaves at noon. Be on it with your bag for San Angelo, so no one suspects. I'll meet you at the first stop, and we'll continue to El Paso from there, on horseback. It'll be faster. He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. And Florence, don't tell anyone what we're doing. Not your father, not your mother, no one. The fewer people who know, the safer we'll all be. Florence nodded, understanding the wisdom, even though part of her wanted to rush inside and tell her father everything immediately. She dismounted and unsaddled Daisy as quietly as possible, then made her way back to the oak tree. Climbing up was harder than climbing down had been, her legs shaky from the long ride and her emotions in turmoil, but she managed it. In her room, she changed back into her nightgown and lay in bed, knowing sleep would be impossible. Her lips still tingled from Xavier's kiss. Her mind raced with plans and possibilities. Everything was about to change, and for the first time in her life, Florence wasn't afraid of change. She was excited by it. Morning came slowly, the sky lightening from black to gray to the pale blue of a new day. Florence rose and dressed carefully, choosing a practical traveling outfit. She packed a small bag with essentials, trying to think about what she would actually need for a new life, rather than what a lady should have for a short visit to relatives. At breakfast, she announced her plans to visit Aunt Margaret in San Angelo. Her mother was delighted, immediately launching into a list of things Florence should tell her aunt about the wedding. Her father just nodded, distracted by the newspaper and his morning coffee. I'll take the noon stage, Florence said, forcing herself to eat toast she didn't want. I should be back in 4 or 5 days. Perfect timing, dear. That'll give you a nice break before the final rush of wedding preparations. Her mother reached across the table to pat her hand. And maybe Margaret can help calm your nerves. She always had a steadying influence. Florence felt a pang of guilt at deceiving her mother, but she pushed it aside. When this was all over, when Preston's crimes were exposed and her father was safe, her mother would understand. At least, Florence hoped she would. The morning dragged by with agonizing slowness. Florence tried to act normal, but her nerves were stretched tight as wire. Every knock at the door made her jump, certain it would be Preston or his father, somehow aware of what she'd witnessed. But no one came except the dressmaker with a question about the wedding gown's hem length. Finally, it was time to leave. Her father's driver took her to the stage office, helping her aboard with her small bag. The stage was already half full with other passengers, including a minister and his wife, a traveling salesman, and a weathered old rancher who looked like he'd been riding stages since before Florence was born. As the stage pulled away from Fort Stockton, Florence looked back at the town that had been her home for 3 years. From this distance, it looked peaceful, almost pretty in the midday sun, the fort's buildings solid and reassuring. She wondered if she'd ever see it again, and was surprised to find she didn't much care either way. Fort Stockton represented her old life, the cage of expectations and proper behavior she'd been living in. Whatever came next, it would be on her own terms. The first stage stop was a way station about 10 miles out, a rough building that offered fresh horses and terrible coffee. As the stage pulled in, Florence saw Xavier waiting near the corral, 2 horses saddled and ready. Her heart did a strange flip in her chest at the sight of him. "I'm afraid I need to leave the stage here," Florence told the driver as he helped passengers down. "I'm meeting someone." The driver looked skeptical, but shrugged. It wasn't his business what passengers did once they got off. Florence collected her bag and walked toward Xavier, very aware of the curious looks from the other passengers. Let them wonder, let them gossip. None of it mattered anymore. "Ready?" Xavier asked when she reached him. His eyes searched her face, looking for doubt or regret. More than ready. He tied her bag to one of the horses and helped her mount. The minister's wife was still watching them, her expression disapproving, and Florence felt a wild urge to laugh. If that woman knew the truth, knew that Florence was riding off with a cowboy she'd kissed in the moonlight while planning to expose her fiancé as a criminal, she'd probably faint dead away. They rode hard for the rest of the day, stopping only to water the horses and eat the provisions Xavier had packed. The landscape gradually changed as they traveled, becoming more mountainous, the desert giving way to rocky terrain cut through with canyons. Xavier knew the country well, taking shortcuts that kept them off the main road where they might encounter other travelers or, worse, someone working for the Whitmores. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Xavier led them to a small canyon with a spring at its base. "We'll camp here tonight. It's secluded, and the water's good." Florence dismounted, her legs stiff from the long ride. She'd ridden before, but never for this many hours straight, and she knew she'd be sore tomorrow. Xavier must have noticed her wincing because he smiled sympathetically. "First day's always the hardest. Tomorrow will be easier." "I'm fine," Florence said, not wanting him to think she couldn't handle this. "Just not used to it." They set up a simple camp, Xavier building a small fire, while Florence unpacked the food. It felt strange and wonderful to be doing these practical tasks together, like they were already a team, already partners. As they ate, the sky darkened and stars began to appear, more stars than Florence had ever seen. So many they looked like someone had spilled diamonds across black velvet. "Tell me about Louisiana," Florence said, wanting to know everything about this man she'd thrown her future in with. "What was it like growing up there?" Xavier leaned back against his saddle, his face thoughtful in the firelight. "Different from Texas, greener, wetter. My mother grew flowers, actual flowers that bloomed year-round. She was from France originally, came over with her family when she was young. She taught me French, tried to teach me manners." He smiled at the memory. "My father was the practical one. He taught me to work hard, to always keep my word, to judge a man by his actions rather than his words." They sound wonderful. They were. Losing them, losing everything, it broke something in me for a while. I spent years angry at the world, taking jobs and leaving as soon as I'd earned enough to move on, never letting myself get attached to places or people because attachment meant vulnerability. He looked at her across the fire. "And then I met you, and all those walls I'd built started crumbling." Florence moved around the fire to sit beside him, her shoulder pressing against his. "I know what you mean about walls. I've spent my whole life being the perfect daughter, the perfect lady, never questioning, never demanding, never wanting more than what was offered. It's exhausting, pretending to be someone you're not. You don't have to pretend with me." She turned to look at him, seeing the truth in his eyes. "I know. That's why this feels right, even though it's crazy and impulsive and completely improper." Xavier's hand came up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering on her cheek. "Florence, I need you to be sure about this. Once we get to El Paso, once we expose Preston, there's no going back to your old life. Your reputation will be ruined. Your family might disown you. You'll be tied to me, a nobody cowboy with nothing to offer but trouble and uncertainty. You're offering me freedom, Florence said simply. You're offering me honesty and adventure and the chance to be myself. That's worth more than all the reputation and security in the world. She leaned closer, her lips almost touching his. Besides, you're wrong about one thing. You're not a nobody. You're everything. Their second kiss was even better than the first, slow and deep and full of promise. Xavier's arms came around her, pulling her closer, and Florence melted into him, feeling safe and excited and more alive than she'd ever felt. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. We should get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be another long day of riding. They arranged their bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire, propriety making one last stand even though they were alone in the wilderness. But as Florence lay there staring up at the stars, she heard Xavier's voice carry across the darkness. Florence? Yes? Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for being worth trusting. She fell asleep smiling, despite the hard ground and the uncertain future, and all the very valid reasons she should be terrified. For the first time in her life, Florence felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Morning came with the harsh cry of a hawk circling overhead. Florence woke stiff and sore, every muscle protesting the previous day's ride. Xavier was already up, the fire rekindled, coffee brewing in a battered pot. He handed her a tin cup with a smile. How are you feeling? Like I've been beaten with sticks, Florence admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. But I'll manage. They were back in the saddle within the hour, pushing hard toward El Paso. The landscape continued to change, becoming more dramatic, with mountains rising sharply on either side of the trail. Xavier explained that they were skirting the southern edge of the Guadalupe Mountains, taking a route that was faster but more challenging than the main road. Around midday, they stopped to rest the horses and eat. Florence was examining a tear in her skirt, caused by catching on a thorny bush, when Xavier suddenly went still, his hand moving to his pistol. "What is it?" Florence whispered. "Riders, coming fast." He pulled her behind a large boulder, the horses hidden behind a curve in the canyon wall. "Stay quiet." 3 men came into view, riding hard, and Florence's heart sank as she recognized them. They worked for the Whitmore ranch, the same men who'd been at the gun exchange. They were tracking someone, and Florence had a sinking feeling that someone was Xavier and her. The men rode past without seeing them, but their presence confirmed Florence's fears. "They're looking for us," she said, once the sound of hooves had faded. Preston must have realized something's wrong. Maybe they're just running an errand. But Xavier's expression was grim. Either way, we need to be more careful, and we need to move faster. They pushed the horses harder than Florence knew was wise, but Xavier seemed to know exactly how much the animals could take. As the day wore on and the sun climbed toward its peak, the heat became oppressive. Florence's face burned despite her bonnet, and her throat was parched despite regular sips from her canteen. "How much farther?" she asked during a brief stop. "If we keep this pace, we should reach El Paso by tomorrow afternoon. There's a small settlement about 3 hours ahead, where we can spend the night in actual beds, get a hot meal." He studied her face with concern. "You're holding up better than I expected." "I'm tougher than I look. I'm learning that." He smiled, and Florence felt warmth that had nothing to do with the desert sun. They reached the settlement as twilight fell, a collection of buildings that barely qualified as a town. The hotel was a generous term for the 2-story structure, with rooms for rent, but it looked like paradise to Florence after 2 days of hard riding. Xavier got them separate rooms, maintaining the fiction that they were siblings traveling to meet family, though the desk clerk's skeptical look suggested he didn't believe it. Florence's room was small but clean, with a real bed and a wash basin with actual water. She cleaned up as best she could, washing away days of dust and sweat, then changed into the one clean dress she'd packed. When she looked in the cracked mirror, she barely recognized herself. Her face was sunburned, her hair was wild despite her attempts to tame it, and her eyes had a brightness that hadn't been there before. Xavier knocked on her door as the last light faded from the sky. "There's a restaurant downstairs. Nothing fancy, but the food's supposed to be decent." The restaurant was crowded with locals and travelers, the air thick with the smell of frying meat and tobacco smoke. Xavier found them a table in the corner, away from the worst of the noise. They ordered steak and potatoes, and Florence had never tasted anything so good. "Tomorrow, when we get to El Paso," she said between bites, keeping her voice low, "what exactly will we do? We'll go to the federal marshal's office and tell them everything. The guns, the illegal shipments, your father's company being used as cover. We'll give them the ledger page and tell them where they can find evidence of the exchange we witnessed." Xavier paused, his expression serious. "They'll want to investigate, which means they'll go to Fort Stockton. They'll question your father, Preston, the Whitmores. It's going to cause a huge scandal. My father will be questioned. He'll have to be, to maintain the appearance of a legitimate investigation. But once they see the evidence, once they realize he was being used, he'll be cleared." Xavier reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "I know this is hard, Florence. I know you're worried about your family. But this is the only way to protect them in the long run." Florence nodded, understanding the logic even as her heart ached at the thought of her father being subjected to questioning, the shame and confusion he would feel. "And after the investigation? After we disappear for a while, let things settle. The Whitmores will be arrested if everything goes the way it should, but they have money and influence. They might find a way to avoid prison, or at least minimize their sentences. Either way, they'll blame us for their downfall." He squeezed her hand. "I've been thinking about California. I have a cousin in San Francisco who wrote me last year, said there was work there, opportunities. We could start fresh, build something new." California. Florence tested the word, tried to imagine it. She'd never been farther west than Fort Stockton, had never seen the ocean. "That sounds wonderful. You understand what I'm asking, don't you? I'm asking you to come with me, really come with me. Not just on this trip to El Paso, but after, forever." Xavier's eyes were intense, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen. "I'm asking you to marry me, Florence Earnsworth, even though I have nothing to offer you but uncertainty and trouble." Florence felt tears prick her eyes, but they were happy tears. "Xavier Landry, yes, 1,000 times, yes." She laughed, the sound drawing curious looks from nearby tables. "Though I should warn you, I have no idea how to be a wife outside of what my mother taught me, and somehow I don't think making proper tea and managing servants is going to be useful in California. You'll learn, we'll learn together." Xavier stood, pulling her to her feet, and right there in the crowded restaurant, he kissed her, not caring who saw or what they thought. When they finally pulled apart, Florence was breathless and blushing, but she'd never felt happier. They went back upstairs to their separate rooms, and Florence lay in the actual bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind full of plans and possibilities. Tomorrow, they would reach El Paso. Tomorrow, they would expose Preston, and then they would start their life together, whatever that looked like. She must have eventually fallen asleep because the next thing she knew, someone was pounding on her door. Florence jolted awake, disoriented in the darkness. The pounding came again, urgent and frightening. "Florence, open the door! Now!" Xavier's voice tight with tension. She stumbled out of bed and unlocked the door. Xavier pushed inside, his face grim in the lamplight from the hallway. "We need to leave, right now." "What happened?" "The men from yesterday, the ones who rode past us. They're here, downstairs in the saloon. They're asking questions, showing your picture around." He was throwing her things into her bag as he spoke, efficient despite the urgency. "Someone must have sent a telegraph ahead, warned them we might be coming this way." Florence's mind raced as she quickly changed from her nightgown to her traveling dress. "How did they get a picture of me?" "Preston probably had one. Or your family. It doesn't matter. What matters is they're looking for us, and we need to be gone before they realize we're here." They slipped out through the back stairs, Xavier leading the way with the confidence of someone who always knew where the exits were. The horses were still saddled, which Xavier had insisted on, despite the stableman's protests, and now Florence understood why. They mounted quickly and rode out of the settlement at a walk, not wanting to draw attention with the sound of galloping hooves. Only when they were a mile away did Xavier urge his horse to a faster pace. They rode through the darkness, the moon providing just enough light to see the trail. Florence's heart raced, adrenaline pushing away the exhaustion. This was real danger now, not just the abstract threat of scandal or social ruin, but actual men with guns hunting them. "How far to El Paso?" she asked, when they finally slowed to rest the horses. About 8 hours of hard riding. We can't stop. Can't risk them catching up. Xavier looked at her in the moonlight, his expression fierce with determination. Can you make it? I can make it. They rode through the night and into the morning, the landscape gradually transforming from desert to something slightly greener as they approached the Rio Grande Valley. Florence was exhausted beyond anything she'd ever experienced, every part of her body screaming in protest. But she kept going, driven by necessity and determination. The sun was high when El Paso finally came into view, a sprawling town that looked enormous compared to Fort Stockton. It had been a major stop on the trade routes for decades, and it showed in the diversity of buildings and people. They rode straight through to the federal marshal's office, a solid building near the center of town with a flag flying outside. Xavier helped Florence dismount, and she nearly collapsed when her feet hit the ground, her legs refusing to support her properly. He caught her, his arm around her waist, and they stumbled inside together. The marshal was a man in his 50s, with iron-gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He looked up from his desk as they entered, taking in their dusty, exhausted appearance with the practiced assessment of someone who'd seen everything. "Help you folks? We need to report a crime," Xavier said, his voice hoarse from the long ride and lack of sleep. "A serious one, involving illegal gun running and freight fraud." The marshal leaned back in his chair, his interest clearly piqued. "That's so? Well, you'd better sit down and tell me everything." For the next 2 hours, they laid out the entire story. Xavier provided the ledger page, his testimony about what he'd seen and overheard. Florence corroborated everything, adding details about Preston's questions regarding her father's business, the way he'd manipulated her family's trust. The marshal listened carefully, taking notes, asking sharp questions that showed he understood the implications. "This is serious," he said finally. "If what you're telling me is true, we're looking at multiple federal crimes. The gun theft alone could mean prison time, and using the freight company as a cover adds conspiracy charges." He looked at Florence with something that might have been sympathy. "Miss Earnsworth, you understand that your testimony against your fiancé will cause significant scandal?" "Former fiancé," Florence said firmly. "And yes, I understand. But my father is an innocent man being used as a criminal's cover. I won't let that stand, no matter what it costs me personally." The marshal nodded approvingly. "All right, I'll need a few days to verify some of this information and gather my deputies. Then we'll ride to Fort Stockton and make arrests." He turned to Xavier. "You're sure about the location of that warehouse where they stored the guns?" "Positive. Northern edge of the Whitmore property, about 3 miles from the main ranch house. It's an old building. Used to be a barn before they converted it." "Good. That gives us a place to start." The marshal stood, extending his hand first to Xavier, then to Florence. "You two did the right thing coming here. Took guts, especially for you, Miss Earnsworth. A lot of women would have just kept quiet to avoid the scandal." "I'm not a lot of women," Florence said, and meant it. Outside the marshal's office, in the bright afternoon sun, Xavier and Florence looked at each other and started to laugh, the kind of slightly hysterical laughter that comes from exhaustion and relief, and the realization that they'd actually done it. "We need to find somewhere to stay," Xavier said when they'd caught their breath. "Somewhere safe, where those men won't find us if they made it to El Paso." They found a small hotel on the edge of town, run by a Mexican family who asked no questions and offered them their best room. This time, they took only one room, propriety be damned. They were too tired to care what anyone thought, and besides, they were engaged now, even if it wasn't official yet. Florence collapsed on the bed fully clothed and was asleep before Xavier had finished pulling off his boots. When she woke, the room was dark and Xavier was lying beside her, also asleep, his hand somehow finding hers even in slumber. Florence lay there for a moment, watching him in the moonlight that filtered through the window, this man who had turned her entire life upside down in the space of a few days. She must have made some sound because Xavier's eyes opened, immediately alert, despite having been deeply asleep seconds before. "What's wrong?" "Nothing. Everything's right." Florence propped herself up on one elbow. "I was just thinking about how different my life is now compared to a week ago." "Regrets?" "Not a single one." She leaned down to kiss him, soft and sweet. "Though I should probably send a letter to my parents, let them know I'm all right. They must be worried." "We can do that tomorrow. Tonight just rest. We've earned it." They spent the next 3 days in El Paso, waiting for the marshal to organize his investigation. Florence wrote a carefully worded letter to her parents, explaining that she couldn't marry Preston and that she was safe but needed time away. She didn't explain everything, not yet, but she tried to convey that she loved them and would return to explain when it was safe to do so. On the fourth day, the marshal came to their hotel. "We're leaving for Fort Stockton in the morning. I've got 6 deputies coming with me, and we've telegraphed ahead to the army post to have soldiers ready in case the Whitmores try anything stupid." He looked at Florence. "I'd like you both to come along, if you're willing. Your testimony in person will be more powerful than written statements." Florence looked at Xavier, who nodded. "We'll be there," she said. The ride back to Fort Stockton took 2 days with the marshal's party, a slower pace than the desperate flight Florence and Xavier had made in the opposite direction. As they got closer to town, Florence felt her anxiety growing. She would have to face her parents, Preston, everyone who had known her as a perfect daughter, the obedient fiancée. They would see the truth now, and she could only hope they would understand. They arrived in Fort Stockton just after dawn, the town still quiet with early morning. The marshal went first to the sheriff's office, and Florence almost laughed at the expression on Sheriff Thompson's face when he learned why federal marshals were in his town. The sheriff had always been firmly in the Whitmore's pocket, and now his corruption was laid bare. The arrests happened quickly after that. Deputies went to the Whitmore ranch and found the warehouse exactly where Xavier had said it would be, still full of stolen army rifles. Andrew Whitmore was taken into custody at his bank, Preston at his father's house. Both men protested loudly, threatening lawsuits and investigations into the investigators, but the evidence was too solid to deny. Florence's father was brought in for questioning, but it was clear from the beginning that he was a victim, not a perpetrator. When the marshal explained how his freight company had been used, showing him the falsified records, Florence watched her father's face go from confusion to anger to a terrible hurt that made her heart ache. When they finally let him go, Florence was waiting outside. Her father saw her and stopped, taking in her dusty traveling clothes, the way she stood close to Xavier, and understanding dawned in his eyes. "Florence?" His voice was rough with emotion. "What have you done?" "I saved you, Papa." Florence stepped forward, tears running down her cheeks. "I saved us all. Preston was using your business to cover his crimes. If I hadn't found out, if Xavier hadn't helped me expose him, you would have been blamed for everything. You could have been hanged." Her father looked at Xavier, assessment and anger warring in his expression. "And who are you exactly?" "Xavier Landry, sir. I worked for the Whitmore Ranch. I'm the one who discovered what Preston was doing." Xavier stood straight, meeting her father's eyes. "I'm also the man who loves your daughter and wants to marry her, if she'll have me and if you'll give your blessing." Florence's father was silent for a long moment, and Florence held her breath, waiting. Finally he sighed, a deep, weary sound. "Come home, both of you. Your mother deserves to hear this story from you directly, and I suspect it's a long one." The scene at the Earnsworth house was difficult. Florence's mother wept, oscillating between relief that Florence was safe and horror at the scandal. But as the full story came out, as Florence and Xavier explained everything that had happened, understanding slowly replaced shock. "You gave up everything," her mother said finally, looking at Florence with something that might have been respect. "Your engagement, your reputation, your place in society." "I gave up a lie, Mother. I'm choosing truth instead, and love, and the chance to live my own life." Florence reached for Xavier's hand. "I know this isn't what you wanted for me, but it's what I want for myself." Her father had been pacing during the entire explanation, his hands clasped behind his back. Now he stopped and turned to Xavier. "What are your intentions toward my daughter?" "Marriage, sir, as soon as possible. And then we're planning to go to California, start fresh. I have a cousin there who can help us get established." Xavier's voice was steady. "I know I'm not what you imagined for Florence. I don't have money or position or family connections. But I love her more than my own life, and I'll spend every day proving myself worthy of her." "Papa, I love him," Florence added quietly. "I know it's fast, I know it seems crazy, but he's shown me what real partnership looks like, what real respect and love look like. I can't go back to the life I had before, not after experiencing this." Florence's father looked between them for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I suppose we should be grateful you have such good instincts, daughter. If you'd married Preston without discovering his crimes, our entire family would have been ruined." He extended his hand to Xavier. "You have my blessing, though I reserve the right to be skeptical until you've proven yourself over time." "That's more than fair, sir," Xavier said, shaking his hand. The wedding took place a week later, a small ceremony in the Earnsworth's parlor, attended only by Florence's parents and a few close family friends. Florence wore a simple dress, nothing like the elaborate gown that had been prepared for her wedding to Preston, but she'd never felt more beautiful. When Xavier took her hand and spoke his vows, his voice shaking slightly with emotion, Florence felt her heart swell with certainty that this was right, that this was exactly where she was meant to be. Preston and his father were awaiting trial, and the scandal had rocked Fort Stockton to its foundation. The bank had been placed under federal oversight, and the Whitmore ranch was being sold to pay legal fees and restitution. Sheriff Thompson had resigned in disgrace. The entire power structure of the town had shifted, and Florence's father found himself suddenly elevated to a position of respect and influence as one of the few business owners who had emerged from the scandal with his reputation intact. "Are you sure about leaving?" Florence's mother asked the night before they were due to depart for California. "Your father could use your help now, rebuilding his business." "I'm sure, Mother." Florence hugged her, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender that had meant home for so long. "This is something Xavier and I need to do together, building our own future rather than fitting into one that already exists." "Write to us," her mother said, tears in her eyes. "Often, let us know how you are, where you settle." "I promise." The journey to California took 6 weeks, traveling by stage and train, and occasionally horseback through territories that were still wild and unsettled. Florence saw landscapes she'd only read about: vast prairies, towering mountains, forests so thick the sunlight barely penetrated. She saw Native American tribes and mining camps, bustling railroad towns and lonely outposts. Every day brought something new, some fresh adventure or challenge, and through it all, Xavier was beside her, steady and sure. They reached San Francisco in the autumn of 1878, when the city was booming with people drawn by opportunity and the promise of reinvention. Xavier's cousin, a man named Jean-Paul, who had emigrated from Louisiana years earlier, helped them find a small house on the edge of the city and introduced Xavier to people who could offer work. Xavier found employment with a freight company, his experience and honest reputation serving him well. Florence, to her own surprise, discovered a talent for bookkeeping and accounting. The skills she'd learned managing her mother's household translated well to managing business accounts, and soon she was helping Xavier's employer with the company books. Within a year, they'd saved enough to invest in their own small freight wagon, taking on independent contracts. The work was hard, nothing like the life Florence had been raised to expect, but it was honest, and it was theirs. She learned to drive a wagon, to negotiate prices, to hold her own in rooms full of men who initially dismissed her, but soon learned to respect her sharp mind and fair dealing. Xavier taught her to shoot, to read the land, to make quick decisions under pressure, and she taught him that education and refinement weren't about social class, but about curiosity and respect, sharing books with him in the evenings and discussing ideas late into the night. Their first child came in the summer of 1880, a boy they named James after Xavier's father. He had his father's eyes and his mother's determination, and from the moment Florence held him, she understood a new dimension of love. Xavier was an attentive father, tender and patient, and watching him with their son made Florence love him even more. Letters came regularly from Fort Stockton. Florence's parents had adjusted to their daughter's new life better than she'd expected, and her mother's letters were full of news about the town, requests for stories about California, and increasing acceptance of the choices Florence had made. Preston and his father had both been convicted and sentenced to prison, and the shock of their fall had worn off, replaced by a general sense that justice had been served. In 1882, Florence gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Marie after Xavier's mother. The little girl had her grandmother's French features and a temperament that swung between sweetness and fierce independence. Their small house rang with laughter and noise, so different from the quiet, controlled environment Florence had grown up in, and she loved every chaotic moment. The freight business grew steadily. By 1885, they'd expanded to 3 wagons and employed 2 other drivers. Xavier's reputation for reliability and honesty meant they were never short of contracts, and Florence's skill with numbers and negotiations meant they maximized every opportunity. They were never wealthy, not by the standards Florence had been raised with, but they were comfortable and, more importantly, they were happy. In the evenings, after the children were in bed, Florence and Xavier would sit on their porch, watching the sun set over the bay, and talk about the journey that had brought them here. Sometimes Florence thought about that day in Fort Stockton, when a gunshot had changed everything, when Xavier had touched her elbow and introduced himself. It felt like a lifetime ago, and like yesterday all at once. "Do you ever regret it?" Xavier asked one evening, his arm around her shoulders. "Giving up the life you could have had?" "Which life? The one where I married a criminal and lived a lie? Where my father was destroyed by forces he didn't understand? Where I spent my days being ornamental and useless?" Florence shook her head. "I don't regret a single moment, Xavier. You gave me the truth, and with it, you gave me freedom. You gave yourself freedom. I just pointed you toward the door. You're the one who had the courage to walk through it. We walked through it together." Florence turned to kiss him, their lips meeting in a kiss that still held all the passion and promise of that first night in the canyon. "That's the best part. Everything we've built together." Their third child, another boy they named Thomas, came in 1887, completing their family in a way that felt perfect and right. The house was too small now, bursting with children and life, so they bought a larger place with room for the business office and a yard where the children could play. Jean-Paul and his family lived nearby, and the cousins grew up together, bilingual and adventurous, embodying the best of both their French and American heritages. Florence's parents came to visit in 1890, their first trip to California. Florence's mother was amazed by the life her daughter had built, and her father spent hours talking business with Xavier, their relationship evolving from skeptical acceptance to genuine respect and friendship. On the last night of their visit, Florence's father pulled her aside. "I owe you an apology," he said gruffly. "When you were young, I thought my job was to secure your future by finding you a proper husband, someone who could provide comfort and security. I didn't understand that what you really needed was someone who would be your partner, your equal. You chose far better for yourself than I ever could have chosen for you. You raised me to be strong and smart, Papa. You just didn't expect me to use those qualities to forge my own path." Florence hugged him tightly. "But I learned from the best. Your honesty, your integrity, your belief in fair dealing, those are the foundations Xavier and I built our business on." As the years passed, Fort Stockton became more memory than reality for Florence, a place that had shaped her but no longer defined her. Occasionally she'd hear news from old friends or read about developments in the West Texas newspapers that made their way to California. The town had recovered from the scandal, and her father's business had prospered. Preston had been released from prison after serving 8 years and had left Texas, disappearing into obscurity somewhere back east. His father had died in prison, his empire scattered to the winds. But Florence's focus was always forward, on the life she was building, rather than the one she'd left behind. She watched her children grow strong and confident, educated and curious, free from the rigid expectations that had bound her own childhood. James showed an interest in mechanics and engineering, spending hours taking apart and rebuilding anything he could get his hands on. Marie was artistic and passionate, filling notebooks with sketches and stories. Thomas was still young, but showed signs of his father's steady, thoughtful nature. In 1895, on their 15th wedding anniversary, Xavier surprised Florence with a trip to a new resort that had opened in the mountains outside San Francisco. They left the children with Jean-Paul's family and spent 3 days alone together, something they hadn't done since the early days of their marriage. On their last evening, sitting by a lake that reflected the mountains and sky like a mirror, Xavier took Florence's hand. "Do you remember that night in the canyon when we were running to El Paso?" Florence looked at him, this man who had risked everything to tell her the truth, who had stood beside her through scandal and hardship, who had helped her build a life beyond anything she'd imagined possible. His face showed the lines of hard work and laughter. His hands were calloused from years of physical labor, and his eyes still held that same warmth and integrity that had drawn her from the first moment. "I got more than I wanted," she said softly. "I got a partner who respects me, children who make me proud every day, work that matters, and a love that grows stronger rather than weaker with time. I got a life that's messy and real and completely my own." She leaned her head on his shoulder, watching the light fade from the sky. "I got you, Xavier," and that was always more than enough. They sat in comfortable silence as stars began to appear, the same stars that had watched over them that first night in the desert so many years ago. Fort Stockton was 1,000 miles away, and a lifetime ago, but Florence was grateful for every moment of that journey, even the frightening parts, even the painful parts, because they had led her here, to this man, to this life, to this perfect moment of peace and contentment. The cowboy had told her the truth, and the truth had set her free. Everything that came after, all the joy and struggle and triumph, flowed from that single act of honesty. And as Florence sat beside her husband, watching the stars emerge one by one above the California mountains, she knew with absolute certainty that she would choose this life, and this man, again and again, in every possible version of her story. Their business continued to thrive, expanding beyond freight to include warehousing and logistics. By the turn of the century, Xavier and Florence employed over 20 people, and their company had a reputation throughout San Francisco for fair dealing and reliable service. James joined the business after finishing school, bringing new ideas about efficiency and modernization. Marie shocked everyone by announcing she wanted to study art in Paris, and Xavier and Florence supported her dream, sending their daughter across the ocean with their blessing and enough money to see her through 3 years of study. Thomas showed an interest in the law, defending those who couldn't defend themselves, a calling that made both his parents proud. As Florence entered her 40s, she looked back on the girl she'd been in Fort Stockton with something like amazement, that Florence had been so careful, so concerned with propriety and expectations, so afraid of making waves or causing scandal. This Florence knew who she was and had no apologies for it. She wore practical clothes instead of fashionable ones, spoke her mind in business meetings, and was known throughout their industry not as Xavier Landry's wife, but as Florence Landry, co-owner and chief financial officer of Landry Freight and Logistics. In 1902, Florence's mother passed away peacefully in her sleep, and Florence traveled back to Texas for the funeral. It was her first time in Fort Stockton in over 20 years, and the town felt both familiar and foreign. Her father had grown frail but was still sharp-minded, and he gripped her hand tightly at the service. "She was proud of you," he said. "Even when she didn't understand your choices, she was proud of the woman you became." Florence stayed in Fort Stockton for 2 weeks, helping her father sort through years of accumulated possessions and memories. She found her old wedding dress, the one that had been made for her marriage to Preston, packed away in a trunk. For a moment she just stared at it, this symbol of the life she'd almost lived, and then she carefully folded it and put it back. It was part of her history, and she wouldn't deny it, but it held no power over her anymore. When she returned to California, Xavier met her at the station, and the sight of him made her heart lift the way it had for over 2 decades. They'd built something real and lasting, something that had weathered every storm, and Florence knew with absolute certainty that the choices she'd made that summer in 1878 had been the right ones, even when they'd seemed crazy and reckless and impossible. The years continued to unfold, bringing changes and challenges, joys and sorrows. Xavier's hair went gray, then white. Florence's hands developed arthritis that made bookkeeping more difficult, so she trained younger employees to take over while she focused on strategy and planning. Their children grew, married, and gave them grandchildren who filled their lives with noise and laughter and new adventures. On their 30th wedding anniversary in 1905, their children threw them a party that brought together everyone whose lives they'd touched over the years. Employees and business partners, friends and family, neighbors and clients, all gathered to celebrate the couple who had built something lasting through hard work and unwavering partnership. James stood to make a toast, his voice carrying across the crowded room. "My parents' story begins with a secret and a choice. Someone told my mother a truth that changed everything, and she had the courage to act on it, to walk away from comfort and certainty and choose truth and love instead." He raised his glass toward Xavier and Florence. "They taught us by example that real success isn't measured in money or status, but in integrity, partnership, and the courage to build the life you want rather than accepting the life others plan for you." To Xavier and Florence Landry, the finest parents and the finest people I know. The room erupted in cheers and applause, and Florence felt tears streaming down her face. happy tears that spoke to how far they'd come and how much they'd built together. Xavier's arm came around her waist, pulling her close, and she leaned into him, this man who had been her partner in every sense of the word for 30 years. Later, when the guests had gone and the house was quiet, Xavier and Florence sat on their porch, the same porch where they'd spent countless evenings over the years, and looked out at the city lights spreading below them. San Francisco had grown tremendously, becoming a true metropolis, and they'd grown with it, adapting and evolving while staying true to their core values. "Do you think we made the right choices?" Xavier asked, and Florence knew he wasn't really asking. He was offering her a chance to reflect, to assess, to appreciate the journey they'd traveled together. "Every single one," Florence said firmly. "Even the ones that were hard, even the ones that hurt, even the ones that seemed impossible at the time. They all led here, to this life, to this family, to us." She took his hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of decades of practice. "You gave me the truth when lies would have been easier. You stood beside me when standing alone would have been safer. You loved me when I was imperfect and difficult and learning how to be myself. How could any of those choices be wrong?" Xavier lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles the way he'd done so many times over the years. "I was just a cowboy who couldn't stand by and watch injustice happen. You were the brave one, Florence. You're the one who had everything to lose and chose truth anyway. We were brave together. That's always been our secret, hasn't it? Separately, we might have been ordinary. Together, we became extraordinary." As the night deepened and the stars emerged, Florence thought about that girl in Fort Stockton who'd been planning a wedding to the wrong man, who'd been living a life designed by others, who'd been sleepwalking through her own existence. She thought about the moment when Xavier's hand had touched her elbow, when his words had shattered her comfortable illusions, when everything had changed forever. The cowboy had told her what he'd witnessed, and in doing so, he'd witnessed the birth of her true self. He'd seen her courage before she knew she had it, believed in her strength before she'd tested it, loved her completely before she'd learned to love herself. And together, they'd built a love story for the ages, not the easy fairy tale Florence had imagined as a girl, but something far better, a partnership forged in truth and tempered by challenge, a love that grew deeper and stronger with every passing year. In the end, Florence reflected as she sat beside her husband under the California stars. That was what mattered, not the scandal they had caused or the expectations they had defied or the conventional life they'd rejected. What mattered was that they had chosen each other honestly and completely, and they'd built something real and lasting from that choice. They'd created a family, a business, a life that reflected their values and their dreams. The truth had set them free, and love had made them whole. Everything else was just details, stories to tell the grandchildren, memories to cherish in the quiet moments. But the core of it, the heart of their story, remained constant and true. A cowboy had seen injustice and spoken up. A young woman had found the courage to listen. And together, they had ridden off into a sunset that became a sunrise, into a future they created with their own hands, into a love that lasted not just until death, but beyond, written in the lives of their children and grandchildren, in the business they built, in the community they served, in every choice they made to be honest and brave and true. As Florence drifted off to sleep that night in Xavier's arms, she smiled, content in the knowledge that the choice she'd made in that dusty Texas town so many years ago had been the best choice of her life. The cowboy had told her the truth, and the truth had led her home, not to a place, but to a person, not to comfort, but to joy, not to the life she'd planned, but to the life she was meant to live. And in the end, that made all the difference.